The Special Sheet to the Assynt district, published in 1923, is one of the world's great geological maps. It shows dramatic stratigraphic features like these unconformities and igneous geology like these sills, but the Assynt map is famous for showing thrust structures, spectacularly displayed in a series of cross-sections. But the geological mapping the Assynt sheet displays started in 1885 as part of a major programme of scientific investigation instigated by the Director General of the Geological Survey, Archibald Geekie. My name's Rob Butler, and I've worked much of the key ground in the Northern Highlands. We can use this together with these original maps to tell the story of how the Assynt sheet came to be made, placing it in the context of these original older maps. So this is a story about geologists facing challenges, wild countryside, even wilder weather, and to an extent scientific bureaucracy to get their story out. Well, let's go back to the 1870s, before the advent of thrust tectonics, and find Archibald Geekie working his way quickly up the career structure of the Geological Survey. He started off under the patronage of Sir Roderick Impey Murchison, and he accepted uncritically Murchison's view of the structure of the Northern Highlands. So let's have a look at what Murchison thought was going on. So let's draw a sketch section across the Northern Highlands to illustrate Murchison's view. So you can put west over here and the low ground climbing up to the hills of Assynt and down and across the Northern Highlands generally until we reach the coast over here at Caithness. So this is east. Well, Murchison and everybody knew that there was a major contact out here in the west between the old gneisses here, which they termed Archean back in the 19th century, and it was overlain by apparently undeformed, gently dipping sandstones of the Torridonian. Now, because these strata were overlying the Archean basement, so the oldest sedimentary rocks here would have been Cambrian. So let's continue, and the Torridonian rocks are overlain unconformably by a sequence of rocks that dip east like this, which I'll just colour in blue like this, and here's the unconformity shown by the Torridon sandstones coming up and the underlying Lewisian or Archean rocks coming underneath like this, and let's just put the contact in like this. So for Murchison, these rocks here, which overlay the, for him, Cambrian Torridonian rocks, must be younger than the Cambrian because of the unconformity. The next system up for him is Silurian. So these rocks were thought to be Silurian in age. Now comes the critical bit, because the idea for Murchison was that these Silurian rocks continued in an unbroken sequence. They may be folded a bit, but basically they are continuing all the way across the Northern Highlands. Okay, there may be the odd intrusive granite in here, but that was fine. We'll just pop that in as an intrusive granite. But all these rocks in here, even though they're folded a bit, form a succession of Silurian strata punctured by granites. And then as we come over to the Caithness side of the section in here, there's another unconformity, and then we get another sequence of rocks on top, which are the Old Red Sandstone, which everyone accepted was Devonian in age. So here's the Murchison view, that there's essentially a series of unconformities bounding the Cambrian on the Archean, rocks we now call the Lewisian, another unconformity of rocks that must be younger than these Torridonian so-called Cambrian rocks, which for Murchison would be Silurian. The term Ordovician was one he didn't accept, nor geeky. And then as we come across to the east, we go into the Old Red Sandstone or Devonian. So all the Highlands, or Northern Highlands, is dominated by this long succession of Silurian. This is the Murchison doctrine, a stratigraphic explanation for the rocks of the Northern Highlands. Murchison died at the age of 79 in 1871, and Archibald Geekie, who was then director of the Scottish branch of the Geological Survey, really pushed these ideas, and they underpinned understanding of Highland geology. Well, as the 1870s progressed into the early 1880s, this view came under serious challenge, and foremost in those challengers was Charles Calloway, and he went to the Durness area to look at the stratigraphy and rock relationships. He was drawn to the Durness area because of limestones like these had the best preserved fossils. Calloway reported his findings initially to the Geological Society in 1881, and he showed faults that had chopped up the stratigraphic relationships, so a simple stratigraphic continuity wasn't really viable. The pressure ramped up. Calloway continued his work in the northwest, and on the 9th of May 1883 he presented a stunning paper to the Geological Society with extensive cross-sections. These included the classic section Down Glen Cool, and he even coined the term thrust to explain the process by which these Archean or Lewisian rocks were carried over the sedimentary. Well, by now, Geekie was the Director General of the entire Geological Survey for the United Kingdom. He couldn't really put up with this challenge, so he sent his best two mappers from the Scottish office, they were Ben Peach and John Horn, to the Durness area to disprove Calloway. They were joined by a third member of the Geological Survey, the new hire Lionel Hinksman, and together they worked the Durness area through 3 months in 1883. A summary of their findings is in the annual report for 1883 that was written up by Archibald Geekie. Now, this is curious because the report on Scottish activities should have been written up by the director for Scotland, who was Henry Howell. So the fact that Geekie reported shows how personally he was taking it. Anyway, some of the results of that early mapping are in 1-inch map sheet 113 for Cape Roth, which shows the relationship between the Torridonian, what they thought were Cambrian rocks, and the underlying Archean basement, the Lewisian, in pink. The really critical ground we'll see shortly for the Durness area. Anyway, Geekie was pretty convinced by what the surveyors had found. As Geekie says in his report, he took the team to see, quote, important sections further south where I, that's Geekie, had in previous years established the order of succession. Presumably this included Knock and Crag, which Geekie had visited as part of a famous tour with Murchison back in 1860, and this is his view of the time that he was trying to impose upon his survey geologists. So Peach, Horn and Hinksman were working at a scale of 6 inches to the mile. That's 1 to 10,560. Geekie's expectation was that once that detailed mapping had been done in the Durness area at that fine scale, the rest of the Highlands could be opened up at a scale of 1 inch to the mile. That's 1 to 63,360, so far less detailed. Let's have a look at the quality of the 6-inch mapping that was done at the time. The rather simple map pattern belies the structural complexity that is restricted to only 1 or 2 corners of this map. Otherwise, the succession looks pretty simple. Geekie looked to be on firm ground. They did it at that scale, in the expectation, according to Geekie, that the Durness area would become a key point from which the rest of the Highlands could be worked out. So at the end of the 1883 field season, Geekie thought that the Murchison model was working fine, that having sorted out the stratigraphy in the Durness area at 6 inches to the mile, the Geological Survey could quickly work through the Highlands at a scale of 1 inch to the mile, and it would take about 11 years to complete the mapping of Scotland, assuming he had a staff of about a dozen geologists. Well, let's move our story on now to 1884, and our survey team of Peach, Horn and Hinksman are joined by Henry Caddell, another new hire, and they turn their attentions to the ground to the east of Durness, on the eastern shores of Loch Erebol. And over there was another challenge developing to the Murchison doctrine. Charles Lapworth was working on the ground around the hill of Ben Arnabol and the surrounding countryside, and he was finding that the successions there were faulty together. And Lapworth, like the survey team, was using 6-inch mapping to provide detail and really establish the geological structure. This is his map. It's a bit scruffy, but the science it shows was game-changing. Lapworth also found this structure, what we now call the Arnabol thrust, and it carries gneisses, the old Lewisian basement, over sedimentary rocks. So Peach, Horn, Hinksman and Caddell were entering controversial ground. They were fortunate because they had 2 months of exceptionally fine weather, and they were able to make their own field maps at 6 inches to the mile. And their mapping confirmed Lapworth's view. They even turned their attention to one of Murchison's type sections for an unbroken Silurian succession. And this is a cross-section from Ben Peach's field notebook. Lots of deformation. Well, after their 2 months of work, the survey team were visited by their boss Archibald Geekie to see how well the Murchison doctrine was standing up. This is what he wrote in the annual report. After fully examining the ground with every disposition to support the views of my predecessor, Sir Roderick Impey Murchison, I am compelled by the evidence to admit that these views can no longer be sustained, and that an entirely new basis has been laid for the geological survey of the Highlands. For the survey team now, the Silurian are only this little piece here, and this is a major zone of tectonic faulting or thrusting that's carried not Silurian rocks up, but actually an entirely different sequence, a package that they termed the eastern schists, we now know as the Moyne. And this is the Moyne thrust. The survey called this tract of deformed rocks the zone of complication, with characteristic understatement. We now call it the Moyne thrust belt. During the winter of 1884-85, the survey team made plans to map out their zone of complication. Infamously, Archibald Geekie rushed to print and in 1884 coined the term thrust and claimed credit for its finding. This seriously angered Charles Calloway and Charles Lapworth's friends and colleagues, and indeed the repercussions of this continued to rumble throughout the rest of Archibald Geekie's career, and to some extent reflected badly on some aspects of the institution of the Geological Survey. Nevertheless, through the winter of 1884 and 85, the survey team began to make plans for mapping their zone of complication between Erebol and Skye. Well, we can follow the story of the mapping by the Geological Survey through Geeky's annual reports, but we've also got these published 1-inch map sheets for the entire region. The original mapping, of course, was done at a scale of 6 inches to the mile, but the 1-inch map sheets will culminate in the publication of the Assynt Special Sheet in 1923. Well, remember, we're just at the start of 1885 still, so how does it take so long? Our gang of 4 field mappers, Peach, Horn, Hinksman and Caddell, are now joined by Charles Clough. So now there are 5 of them who can work this ground. And they started their work in the summer of 1885. But this time they were far less fortunate with the weather, and the ground was pretty tough. This is the ground that was given to Henry Caddell to map. And this is an example of his field map. It's a remarkably fine map, particularly given the rough terrain and the rather harsh weather. Charles Clough was given the ground down at Loch Glencool, and he was going to follow in the footsteps of Charles Calloway, but he did a far more complete job in making a map, and this is his field map. Well, even with these challenging conditions of complicated geology, rough terrain and bad weather, the survey team made good progress. And at the end of the field season, many geologists associated with the survey came up to the Northwest Highlands to find out about the geology. So knowledge was shared amongst the colleagues of the Geological Survey. So in 1886, mapping continued, and the survey team were joined by William Gunn, making a total of 6 people working on the ground. But the weather was very bad, described in Geeky's annual report as being even more tempestuous than the previous year. The survey team put a tent up on the slopes of Memoir Assynt in the high ground, not in nice weather conditions like we can see here. Geeky writes, but in the course of a few days after constant drenching rain, it was blown down. In addition, the field season was rather short because much of the ground was deer forest, and the deer stalkers required geologists to be off the ground so they can carry on with their hunting activities. So the survey team moved to lower ground and mapped in the Tongue area, which was the eastern part of the Loch Erebol sheet, and they continued to work there till November. And the survey team could begin to publish, so the first map sheet, even though it doesn't include any of the zone of complication, appeared, which is the map sheet for the Cape Roth area, which they began to work on in 1883. So the maps are coming out by the end of 1886. The catch is that much of the critical ground still remains to be done because of those bad weather and stalking restrictions. So the plan in 1887 was to continue pushing the map south. First they had to complete the Loch Inver sheet, this is the final version, but they could make hardly any progress. The weather got even worse, and they say they only had 3 weeks of fine weather in the entire summer. Clough was too ill to join them, Peach had sciatica, and Horn had rheumatic problems, so the team was being hit by illness as the mapping continued. So although the priority was to complete this map sheet, there were still 5 square miles remaining at the end of the year. Even though the survey team weren't getting their maps out, through the winter of 1887 and 1888, they thought it important to publish their findings of the structural styles and deformation in the zone of complication. So on April the 25th, Peach and Horn joined Geeky at the Geological Society to present their findings, illustrating the tectonic structure of the Northwest Highlands. They demonstrated the stratigraphic succession that was now established, and they also showed the structural styles. The presentation was very warmly received, even by Charles Lapworth, who was in the audience. Okay, so let's return to the field. So the survey team of Peach and Horn and the rest of their colleagues went north to the Northwest Highlands in May of that year. With only a few square kilometres to survey, the Loch Inver sheet was quickly completed, followed by the Ullapool sheet So they'd now traced the zone of complication as far as Loch Broom. On the downside, Henry Cavill had resigned from the survey following the death of his father so that he could continue to run the family business. Henry Howell, the Scottish director, described this as a serious loss of capacity in the mapping of the Highlands. But the team continued south, and the next challenge was the wilderness ground that lay between Little Loch Broom and Kinlochewe. But the survey started to make new and unexpected findings. We'll talk about those in a second, but they had an impact on the publication of the maps that was already being completed further north. The tongue sheet, which included the critical ground around Loch Erebor, which they obviously really wanted to get out, was described as being sent to the engravers at the end of 1888, but the publication was delayed for what is described in the annual report as the adoption of lettering and signs. In other words, a change in the classification of the rocks. Well, more of that in a minute. Well, in 1889, it was William Gunn who was too ill to go in the field. But at the end of the year, sheet 114, that's the tongue sheet that includes Loch Erebor, was finally published. Sheets 107, the Loch Inver sheet, and sheet 101, the Ullapool sheet, were sent to the engravers, ready for publishing. 1890, and the weather didn't get any better. To quote from the annual report, it was an exceptionally wet season. For weeks at a time, it was almost impossible to make any progress in fieldwork. Ben Peach worked a remarkably long season from the 12th of May to the 15th of December, joined sporadically by his colleagues. The high ground remained inaccessible for large periods of time because of deer stalking, but the survey team could still work the low ground. At the end of the year, this spectacular sheet to the Gairloch district was sent to the engravers. The print run for the Loch Inver and Ullapool sheets begins at this time as well. But something's about to happen. 1891 sees the survey team mapping this wild country known as the Dundonald Forest. And new fossil finds are made. This is the sketch from Ben Peach's field notebook. These trilobites are lower Cambrian in age, and it means that the rocks that the survey had been mapping quite happily as Silurian are actually Cambrian. The Torridonian, therefore, is pre-Cambrian. So the maps need changing. We can compare the key in the original publication of the tongue sheet before and after this fossil find. So the tongue map had to be reproduced with a new key. It delayed the publication again of the Loch Inver and Ullapool maps. So 1892 was a bumper year for the final publication and availability of 1-inch geological maps of the Northwest Highlands. Not only was this wonderful Gairloch sheet published, slightly torn, but also the Ullapool sheet and the Loch Inver sheet. Wonderful maps. Meanwhile, the mappers themselves turned their attention to the southern part of the Moyne Thrust Belt, pushing their boundary lines all the way to Loch Kishorn and Loch Carron. Here's the final map, and this map sheet also includes ground over here on Rasay and Rona, which offer new challenges. Henry Woodward is brought up from England. He's a Jurassic specialist for tackling the rocks on Rasay. Rona was mapped by Teal. Teal is the survey's petrologist. As Geekie put it in his annual report, putting Teal on the ground not only expedited the progress of the mapping, but by gaining practical experience, a clearer insight into the difficult geological problems which, in his strictly petrographical work, he has to consider. So it's always good for petrologists to see the rocks themselves that they're working on. Jethro Teal, of course, went on to succeed Archibald Geekie as the director of the Geological Survey. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1892, Ben Peach was taking a time out from working the rather complicated thrust structures elsewhere in the region to look at these hills here in the Applecross area, and this is his field sketch of these thick Torridonian successions. In his annual report for that year, Archibald Geekie describes the weather as being even more tempestuous than ever. So the mapping of the high ground that lies further east from this map had to wait till the following season. So in 1893, John Horne was mapping these dramatic thrust structures seen in the Ackner-Shellock area. There were also further trilobite finds, especially around the Lochmarie area, which were confirming the Lower Cambrian age for what had previously been thought of as Silurian. 1894, and things seem to be finally coming towards a conclusion after 10 years of vigorous activity under really tough conditions in the Northwest Highlands. Arthur McConaughey, the Geological Survey's paleontologist, comes to the northwest to seek out more trilobite finds to really nail the stratigraphic age. And his finds include the classic areas in Assynt. At the end of the 1894 season, Archibald Geekie comes up on one of his visits, and this time it's to see what Peach and Horne have been finding in this region down here, where a structure we now know as the Kishore Nap has been mapped. This includes a major tract of upside-down Torridonian. And mapping this structure leads them onto the Isle of Skye. So I'm moving on to Skye. The geology is going to change a bit. This means that the main survey team can be broken up and redispersed around the Highlands. So in 1895, Hinksman's mapping in the Grampians and Gunn is working further south. But Clough is moved on to Skye to deal with this problem of how the Torridonian is upside down. And there's the looming problem now as well, which is how does the stuff they've been mapping in the zone of complication link into what they've been terming the eastern schists, the Moyne. Well, actually, the mapping of the Moyne thrust belt, the zone of complication, isn't quite complete. And in 1896, Ben Peach and John Horne returned to Assynt to map the far east of this part of the thrust belt. And in doing so, they complete the map of the thrust belt at least as far as Skye. 1896 also sees the publication of this sheet, sheet 91, to the Gareloch district. So in a 14-year campaign, the Geological Survey team had mapped a swathe of the Northwest Highlands. They'd begun mapping in the Durness area at a scale of 6 inches to the mile, with the intention of downscaling to 1 inch to the mile once the stratigraphic order had been established. But once they realised that it was the structure that needed working out, they retained the 6 inch to the mile scale. The field mapping was compiled at 6 inches to the mile in what they called clean copies. If you like, the definitive statements of the geology. And then it was these maps that were simplified down to the final publication versions at 1 inch to the mile. And it was these 1 inch maps that of course would be compatible with the rest of the mapping of Great Britain. Once the 1 inch maps were drafted, they were sent to the engravers, printed in black and white, and then carefully hand painted. Then they were available for sale. Maps were also generally accompanied by a booklet, a memoir describing the geology, as in this case to the small isles of the Inner Hebrides, where the map and memoir both were published together in 1908. So it was the completed 1 inch maps and the memoirs that were the products by which the efficiency of the Geological Survey could be measured by government. So at the end of the 1890s, after considerable effort by the Geological Survey, they've published the following 1-inch maps. This one here for Cape Roth. They've also published the tongue sheet, which covers the critical ground around Loch Erebor, and they've pushed south to the Loch Inver district, which includes northern Assynt, and they've also got the map going south to Ullapool. So they've mapped and published the maps from Loch Broom to the north. Moving south then, they've mapped this little tiny area of coast here on sheet 100, which connects up with the far more impressive bit of mapping that is on the Gairloch sheet. Then of course they've gone south and into the Moyne Thrust Belt. They've published this map here, which has the Applecross Hills, this area of Kishorn, but then, as a bit of distraction if you like, the islands of Raasay and Rona, and a little smidgenette here of Skye. So these are the published 1-inch sheets. But Geekie also wanted to have published a couple of maps at a scale of 6 inches to the mile, which demonstrated the need to map at that scale to get the kind of detail that they're showing on the 1-inch sheets. So he chose to publish 2 maps. Rather curiously, he chose the Durness district, which is, if you like, where it all began. So this is the published 6-inch map, still wonderfully hand painted, and then rather more obviously the 6-inch map to the Assynt Inchterdamp area with all this complexity of structure. So we can see how the Assynt district is becoming important as a focal point for the Geological Survey to tell the story of the structure of the Northwest Highlands. But the publication of the 1-inch map to the Assynt district is still a way off in the future, in 1923. So what's going to hold up publication? Let's stay in the 1890s a bit longer. Conventionally, the Geological Survey published memoirs to go hand in hand with individual 1-inch map sheets. But in 1897, the decision was taken to schedule a super memoir that would cover the findings of the Geological Survey down the Northwest Highlands. In parallel, it was decided to make the clean copy 6-inch sheets available for inspection if people actually came to the survey offices. And survey photographer Robert Lunn trialled the photographic reproduction of these 6-inch sheets, which apparently was quite successful, so at least the survey could share the results of their mapping, even though they hadn't published all the 1-inch sheets. In addition, some of these reproductions appeared in the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Arts, now the National Museum of Scotland, alongside rock specimens collected from the field. 1898, and Charles Clough injures his foot, which keeps him out of the field, so he can begin work drafting the Northwest Highlands memoir. In 1899, Robert Lunn, the photographer, goes up to the Northwest Highlands to take photographs for the memoir. In the annual report for 1899, the expectation is that the Northwest Highlands memoir will go to press the next year. That's in 1900. So why is it that this memoir doesn't actually hit the shelves until 1907? And let's just have a look at the catalogue of completed 1-inch maps for the year after this memoir appears. So this is for 1908. And there hasn't been any progress in map publication for North West Scotland for the 12 years following the publication of sheet 81, which is that map with all the variety around Kishorn. So why is it at the end of the 19th, going into the 20th century, that everything's grinding to a halt? Well, we can get an idea perhaps at least of one of the reasons if we look at the Inverbroom sheet. The survey team had mapped this zone of complication in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and they'd finished this area up largely as well, where the Lewisian and Torridon group rocks lie. But this yellow terrain is the Moyne, and that generates new problems. Geekie's original thought that the zone of complication would be the key to unlocking the Moyne was unfounded. The Moyne has very different geology with very different types of structures. So in the late 1890s, John Horne and William Gunn were mapping this area here, the Fannic Mountains, and it was taking a long time. So the unravelling of the Moyne was delaying the publication of the 1-inch map sheets that had significant areas of Moyne on them. This map sheet for Inverbroom wasn't finally published until 1913. By having to grapple with the Moyne, it meant that the productivity of the Geological Survey, at least as it looked to government, was pretty poor. In addition, the survey were criticised for persevering with hand-coloured map production. The cost of this detailed hand colouring was rarely recouped from sales, even when a sheet like this Gareloch map would be retailing for only a shade under £100 in today's money. Charles Lapworth, who was a supporter of the survey's work in the North West Highlands, argued strongly that their maps should be available at an affordable price to students. Well, the rather small number of maps published for the North West Highlands and their high price reflected badly on the director, Archibald Geekie. In addition, he was personally under some criticism for failing to support his staff and give them promotions and pay increases, so there was criticism coming from within and outside the Geological Survey. Clearly a new broom was needed. So in 1901, at the age of 65, Archibald Geekie retired as Director General. He was replaced by Jethro Teal, who used the title Director rather less pompously than Geekie's Director General. In Scotland, Henry Howell retired as well, and he was replaced by John Horne. So the Geological Survey was under new management. Well, one of Teal's first tasks was to respond to the Royal Commission on Britain's coal reserves that had reported in 1901 and had found that for the Scottish coal areas, those had not really been remapped since the 1850s. But with an energy crisis looming, I'm sure that there were many in government who saw the mapping of the Moyne as something like a vanity project. But everyone wanted to see the memoir to the North West Highlands come out in print. So as the 20th century started, serious efforts were made to get the memoir out. Ben Peach is confined to the office to draft diagrams and cross sections. But he's also involved in writing 3 other memoirs. There's a huge backlog, and it's not just in the North West Highlands. Production of the memoir dragged on for another 6 years. One of the major problems was that the individual mappers wrote different sections of the memoir, which led to the incorporation of excessive detail. Archibald Geekie had to come back out of retirement to edit down the Lewisian and Torridonian sections, but it was really only the effort of John Horne and his editing skills that saw the memoir come out at all. The memoir, when it finally appeared in 1907, was 2 years after the retirement of Ben Peach. The memoir included this fantastic summary map and showing for the first time the extensive mapping completed by the Geological Survey in the North West Highlands. It's one of the first Scottish geological maps that's actually printed in colour. Map sheet 71 of Skye and Glenelg excluded all that diverse geology, including the Jurassic rocks and igneous geology. Well, that finally appeared in 1909, along with the memoir published the following year, led by Ben Peach. Colour printing now continued as the norm. So sheet 82 was published directly in colour and includes the classic part of the Moyne Thrust Belt at Achnashillock, along with a huge tract of Moyne rocks and their Lewisian substrate. And this was published in 1913, along with, finally, The Inverbroom sheet. Inverbroom came with its own memoir, which revealed some of the complexity of Moyne geology, and it also reprised content that had appeared in the 1907 memoir. So by 1913, the map coverage was looking pretty good. But a couple of 1-inch sheets held out, meaning that the Moyne thrust belts didn't have a complete coverage of published maps. Not having complete map coverage of the Moyne thrust belt was unfortunate. The system was becoming increasingly important to people across the world trying to understand how thrust tectonics worked. Now, of course, following 1913, the publication of geological maps was suspended going into the First World War, and indeed many geological survey staff were involved in the war effort. So it was somewhat later that the final 2 map sheets appeared. Sheet 102 didn't appear until 1925, and sheet 108 not until 1931. Of course, by the 1930s, people's priorities for understanding the Moyne had changed. We're at a time when people were worried about how granites were formed, and indeed in the memoir by H. Reed, there are these elaborate pictures of the types of granite veins. Grappling with the complexities of Moyne geology continued to frustrate the publication of 1-inch maps, and indeed the completion of the countrywide map of Scotland right up until the 1970s. Fortunately then, the Geological Survey was able to break out of the constraints of publishing to a grid of 1-inch map sheets and come up with this Assynt Special Sheet, and it's that completed the coverage for the Moyne thrust belt, as well as provided this fantastic resource for teaching and for the public at large. So the 40-year journey from Peachhorn and Hinksman's initial work around Durness to the publication of the Assynt Special Sheet is a story of perseverance, of working in hostile weather, in wild country, fitting in fieldwork before the deer stalking season, getting their story out of the Moyne thrust belt and the Precambrian geology to its west was hampered by the survey having to publish their maps on that strict grid of 1-inch sheet numbers, which meant they had to grapple with the complexities of Moyne geology. As a public funded body, the survey couldn't expend its human resources forever on ground with little apparent economic return. But eventually, the brilliant science and fantastic fieldwork of Ben Peach, John Horn, Henry Caddell, William Gunn, Charles Clough and Lionel Hinksman, together with a host of others, was able to shine through in these brilliant maps. For Geekie, he must have been well satisfied to see the results of all that fantastic effort by his staff, and he lived to see the publication of the Assynt sheet. That's 40 years of scientific endeavour.